Okay, so in this project we're going to be building a blurry loading page or loading image. So if I come to this page here, you'll see that the image starts blurred, and we also start with 0%, and then that goes up to 100%, and the image comes into focus. So you could use this to load just about anything. We're just doing a blur effect on the image, but you could load in your site. You could have any other elements in the DOM load in that specific amount of time from when we go to 0 to 100. And we'll have to map different number ranges to the 0 to 100 load. For instance, the image blur is going to be 30 pixels when it starts, and it's going to go down to 0 as we go from 0 to 100. And there's a Stack Overflow function that we're going to use to help us do that, to help us map one number range to another. Alright, so that's it. Let's get started. So we're going to get started on the blurry loading project, and the HTML is going to be really simple. There's actually only 2 lines in the body, but let's add a title here. So we'll call this blurry loading, and then down here let's get rid of the H1, and this is going to be a section. I'm going to give this a class of BG. So this is going to be the background image that we blur, and then we'll have around the text we'll have a class of loading dash text, and we just want to put in here 0%, and that should do it as far as the HTML goes. So let's jump into our style sheet, and there's not too much we have to do here either. I'm going to change the font, so I just want this to be googleapis.com/CSS, and we want to use a font family. I'm going to use a family of Ubuntu, if I can spell family correctly. And then let's change down here, change Roboto to Ubuntu. And then this stuff can really all stay the same. We don't have to change anything here. We don't need flex direction column, but it's not going to hurt if you do leave it. Now for the background, remember we have that section with the class of BG, and we want to set a background. Actually, let's just use the background property and say we want this to be a URL, and the actual image that I'm going to use, I'm just going to copy and paste in. Of course, you can use any image you want. If you want to use this one, you can get it from the link from the repository. So let's make this have no repeat. Let's make it center on the X and Y axis, and cover for the background position. And we want to position this absolute. And then let's set the top. So I'm going to initially just set the top in left to 0. I'm going to change this, and I'll show you why in a couple minutes. And then the width, we'll set that to 100 viewport widths, and the height to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1, because we want this to be behind the 0%, or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels. And then for the loading text, we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. Alright, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. Because this is going to start blurry, and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels in here, that's what it looks like. Now notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to -30 pixels. And let's also set the left to -30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well. And now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript so that we can have this image basically start blurry and then have it work its way up to being clear as this percentage loads here. So now we want to work on actually having this percentage change. So we want it to go from 0 to 100, and then the background image is going to start blurry and then it's going to go to clear as this loads. So first thing, we'll just bring in the two elements we have, which are the load text. So let's say document dot query selector, query selector, and we have a class of text, or what we call loading text. And then we also want the background, so that has a class of BG, and we'll just call this BG. Okay, now I'm going to initialize a value here called load, which is going to start at 0. Obviously, it's going to go from 0 to 100. And we're going to have a function here called blurring. And right now, I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run every 30 milliseconds. So let's create a variable here called int. So we'll say let int and set this to set interval. And the function we want to run is the blurring function, and let's say every 30 milliseconds. Okay, this is not 30 seconds, this is 30 milliseconds, which is very quick. So I'm going to save this, and if we go and we open up our dev tools here and we go to the console, you're going to see it's just going to go from 0 and it's going to increment every 30 milliseconds forever. It's just going to keep going. Obviously, we don't want that. We want it to go from 0 to 100. So what we'll do here, actually I'll leave the console log for now, and let's say if the load value is greater than 99, then we want to stop that interval, and the way we do that is with the clear interval function. So we want to pass in int because that represents this set interval. So now if I save that, when it gets to 100, it should stop. Okay, so that's what we want. Now, instead of just console logging, obviously we have some stuff in the DOM that we want to work with, that we want to change. One is going to be the text. So let's take the load text and set the inner text value, and I'm going to set that to, let's use some template string here, and we want the load, okay, whatever that is at the time, and then just a percentage sign. So if I save that, you'll see that this will start counting up to 100. And also the way that I want this to show is not only count up to 100, but it's going to start fully opaque, and then it's going to start to fade out as it loads up. All right, so what we'll do is take the load text and set the opacity. So let's say style.opacity, .opacity. And this is going to be tricky because the opacity value isn't going to be the load value, because that goes from 0 to 100. Opacity goes from 0 to 1, right? So it's going to start at, or actually in our case, we want it to start full, fully opaque, so 1, and we want it to go to 0. So we have to map a range of numbers, that is basically 0 to 100, to going from 1 to 0 in the same amount of time. Now, there's actually a Stack Overflow post that we're going to use here to reference. And this person asks either in JavaScript or jQuery to map a range of numbers to another range of numbers, because that's what we want to do. We want to map 0 to 100 to 1 to 0 for the opacity. And this is the question here, but the answer that I want to show you is this one here. So it's pretty simple. It takes in a number, it takes in the minimum and the maximum of the in number, which in our case is going to be 0 and 100, so the load, and then outmin is going to be 1, opacity 1, and then outmax is going to be 0, okay, because we want it to go from solid to disappeared. So I'm going to actually put this link here. I'm going to put this at the bottom of the file just in case you need to look at it. And then I'm going to grab this function here called scale, and we're going to put this right here. And then what we can do is when we're setting this opacity, we'll run it through scale, and we're going to pass in the number, which is load. So that's basically, that's the amount of time that we want this stuff to happen. So when that goes from 0 to 100, we want to map opacity from 1 to 0. If we were starting invisible and going to opaque, then we would do 0, 1, but we're doing it the other way around. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go to the page here, and I'm going to save, and this will run. And now you can see it's going to just slowly fade out as it gets closer to 100. All right, so this is actually a really handy little function. Let's put this, put this right up here so we know that that goes with that. And Stack Overflow is great for little functions like this to do a specific task. Now we have to do the same thing for the blur, because I don't want the blur to be from 100 pixels. I want it to be 30. 30 is the max. So actually I'll just show you right here. If I set in the CSS, that's the max blur I want to do. I don't want to set this to 100 like that. So we have to map the 0 to 100 to 30 to 0, because we're going to start blurred. So we want to start at 30 pixels and bring it down to 0 when the load is done. So let's take the BG, the background, and let's take style. We want to do style dot filter, and we're going to set that to template literal, and let's say blur. And inside here, inside blur, we're going to open up our variable syntax or expression syntax, and we're going to call scale, and we want to scale the load just like we did with the opacity, and it's going to be from 0 to 100 for that load. And then we want the blur to go from 30 to 0 in that same amount of time that load goes from 0 to 100. So let's save that, and oh, I forgot pixels. So we have to have the number. You have to have px in here. So after this expression, we'll do px, and there we go. So now you can see that the background image is going to go from a blur of 30 pixels down to 0 in the same amount of time that the load goes from 0 to 100. Same thing with the opacity of the number. Alright, so that's pretty much it. And of course you could load in anything you want. I chose to do just an image and blur it in, but you could add other effects with stuff that you add to the HTML, that you add to the DOM. But that's it for this project. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.